Good afternoon, hunters. Ervin here to give you a rundown on everything you need to know about the Charge Blade in Monster Hunter Wilds. The Charge Blade is regarded as one of the most technical weapons in the series, and with good reason, as there is an absolute ton of mechanics going on with this weapon. But being such a technical weapon has its benefits. Mastery over its mechanics has a level of satisfaction hard to come by in the RPG genre, and the damage potential of the weapon is some of the highest in the entire game for those willing to put up with its learning curve. As a newcomer, the Charge Blade can certainly be a daunting task to get figured out, but that is precisely why I've put this guide together for you today. So, join me as we cover every aspect of the Charge Blade, from the basic combos and mechanics to the optimal rotations and combat flow, so that you, after you're done watching this video, will be well on your way to mastering the Charge Blade. Let's start off with the basic mechanics, and keep in mind I'm designing this guide with both keyboard and mouse players as well as controller players in mind. So I'll be calling attacks and combos out based on their universal inputs. For example, I'll be saying standard attack when referring to a triangle, Y, or left click input, as I want this information to be equally approachable regardless of your preferred control scheme. First, let's talk about the charge in Charge Blade. While in sword mode, every strike landed causes the blade to charge up energy. This charge is accumulated and visualized in an escalating 3 stages: yellow, red, and finally overheated. Ideally, we want to charge up energy with the sword mode until the blade glows red, then deposit the energy into our files by performing a simultaneous press of both the guard button and heavy attack. This will remove the energy stored within the blade and store it into your files, visualized in the top left corner of your UI. Continuing to utilize sword mode beyond red energy will cause it to overheat. When overheated, your attacks will bounce off enemies and deal reduced damage. So ideally, avoid this happening by storing that energy in your files before we get to this point. Charging up files is the core mechanic when it comes to the Charge Blade's playstyle. Performing a charge when the blade is yellow will fill 3 files, while charging with a red or overheated blade will fill all 5. Files can also be overcharged by repeating this process while they're already full, causing them to glow yellow instead of white, and granting you boosted effects when spending them. The most important way to spend your files, typically at the start of every battle, is charging your shield. The basic way to do this is by initiating a charge and continuing to hold down the button until your character initiates the shield infusion. This is a lengthy animation, but thankfully there is a faster way to do this. In sword mode, perform 3 simultaneous standard heavy attack inputs. This will begin an amplified elemental discharge, which we'll talk about shortly. But to get your shield infusion, we actually want to cancel this attack at the moment the sword enters the shield by pressing guard. This will charge the shield instantly with any available files, as well as perform a horizontal slash at the same time, allowing you to keep your combat flow instead of breaking it to charge manually. While the shield is infused and you're busy charging up your files, or just when you get the opening to do it, you can also charge your sword by holding down standard attack while performing a charge, infusing the sword with energy. The sword, while charged, deals additional discharge damage, will not bounce when overheated, and carries greater impact. This buff leaves you extremely vulnerable while activating it due to the lengthy animation though, so it's best done only when you have the safe distance to perform it. Shield infusion lasts 2 minutes if you expend 5 files to charge it, and about 3.5 minutes if you use 5 overcharged files. Your guard will be enhanced with a much higher degree of resistance, allowing you to stay on your feet even when guarding some of the strongest attacks in the game. But more importantly, the shield functions as the head of our axe when we switch to Axe mode. We can shift our weapon into Axe mode by initiating a morph. There are several methods for doing this, but the most basic way of doing it is by performing a morph strike. This is done with a simultaneous action, pressing both guard and standard attack at the same time. You can also morph / back to sword mode by pressing guard while in Axe mode. In Axe mode, standard attacks are mediocre for how slow they are. You move much slower, and the delay to access your shield can leave you more vulnerable than sword mode, forcing you to rely on dodging attacks more frequently. Your heavy attacks when activated without files or a charged shield are also pretty underwhelming. but when we have Phials available, heavy axe attacks initiate elemental discharges, which deal chunks of additional damage at the expense of our Phials. Overcharged Phials will also increase this additional damage on our attacks by a ton compared to normal ones, and charging the shield before utilizing Axe mode also increases the damage of every attack while in Axe mode, which is why it's so important. We can also expend all of our Phials to initiate one of the heaviest hitting attacks in the entire game, the Super Amplified Elemental Discharge. This attack can be initiated in 3 different ways. By comboing 2 heavy attacks together, then initiating a 3rd heavy attack in a row while in Axe mode, you'll perform an Amplified Elemental Discharge, from this point forward referred to as an AID. This attack has a notably longer animation, but does about twice the damage of a standard Elemental Discharge. Following up with another heavy attack after will activate an Amplified Elemental Discharge follow-up, if you have the time for it, dealing all the damage of your AID, but again. After either the AID or the follow-up, by pressing both standard and heavy attack at the same time, you'll initiate a Super Amplified Elemental Discharge, commonly referred to as a SAED, which does massive damage in a line AoE with extended range at the cost of all remaining Phials. SAED can also be accessed by performing the quick shield charge combo we spoke about earlier, but instead of canceling it, you let the AID fire, perform the follow-up if desired, and then proceed to SAED. SAED itself is already a very long animation, making it a risky move to pull off, so you'll likely not be accessing it through these chains of attacks often. Instead, we can go directly into an AID by pressing both standard and heavy attack as a combo starter while in Axe mode, which can then of course be followed up with a heavy attack if you have the time, and ends in a SAED if you press both standard and heavy again. This is still a pretty slow chain of events as AID makes you very vulnerable, but there is a way to skip straight to SAED following what is known as a perfect guard. When guarding, you take significantly reduced damage. Assuming you have sufficient resistance to the attack and or a charged shield, you will also resist being knocked down or flinched. But by timing the act of guarding just as you would receive damage, you trigger a perfect guard. This not only further reduces the damage you receive, but opens up 2 new combo options, one of which being the ability to immediately initiate a SAED by pressing both standard and heavy attack together following a successful perfect guard. You can also cancel the SAED and infuse your shield instead by pressing guard while the sword is inside the shield. But this is not the only thing perfect guard does. If you instead counterattack with a standard attack following a perfect guard, you'll perform a Savage Axe Slash and activate Savage Axe mode for 120 seconds, visualized as a blue glowing effect behind your Phials while active. While Savage Axe is active, all axe attacks except for SAED can be held down to deal significantly more damage per swing at the expense of taking slightly longer, as the axe head becomes more like a chainsaw tearing through the monster. Additionally, while Savage Axe is active, standard elemental discharges activated with your first 2 heavy attacks do not cost any Phials to activate, and the additional damage from discharge stacks. AID can also be held down with Savage Axe for massive amounts of damage while only expending half of a Phial each use. However, SAED cannot be extended for additional damage with Savage Axe and will still spend all of your Phials. In addition to counterattacking after a perfect guard, there are 2 other ways to enter Savage Axe mode. By pressing Sprint in focus mode, whether you are in Axe mode or Sword mode, you'll perform a leaping attack forward and enter Sword mode if you were not in it already. This attack is already great for moving around the battlefield and getting back into Sword mode quickly while staying mobile, but if this attack connects with a wound on the monster, you'll return to Axe mode immediately and perform a Rend. Rend destroys the wound, does a ton of damage, and locks the monster in place during the animation, functioning as a pseudo amount of free damage. And yet another way you'll enter Savage Axe mode. The final way is through mounting the monster. If you successfully cause a wound during the mount and finish it with a weapon attack, this will not only put the monster into a vulnerable position, but give you Savage Axe in the process. Okay, that is all the mechanics behind Charge Blade. If you didn't download all that info in one go, though, that's honestly to be expected, as I really wasn't kidding when I said Charge Blade has a lot going on. So a revisit to the section later might end up being necessary, and that's okay. Moving on, though, let's talk about the Charge Blade's playstyle options, main combos, how to stay mobile on the battlefield, as well as the general rotation and combat flow that we're looking to achieve with it. When it comes to the Charge Blade, there are really two main playstyles. One playstyle focuses on building up files in sword mode, spending them immediately on SAEDs, then going back to sword mode in a loop. The other, in my opinion, currently better option builds up files, activates Savage Axe mode, and then proceeds to blast the monster for the rest of the fight in Savage Axe mode with elemental discharges, rends, and aids as much as possible. Both are viable from the beginning and can even be used interchangeably depending on the situation, especially early on when you don't have much in the way of gear favoring one playstyle over the other. But I would say early on especially, the Savage Axe playstyle will be superior. Both of these playstyles follow a pretty straightforward rotation, both of which start off by getting the shield infused to increase the damage dealt by Axe mode, and improve our guard as a nice side effect. Ideally, we perform this with 5 overcharged files to get that 3-minute 25-second-ish duration. After you've managed to achieve this, use sword mode to charge up your files. This is the moment that the playstyles can actually diverge a bit. If you're playing to spam SAED, you're likely going to want to immediately proceed to SAED from here if you can find the opening to do so, as the extra damage provided by overcharging the files is basically coming at the cost of performing an entire another SAED, making it not really worth it unless you can't find that opening to use SAED before you've achieved overcharge. Due to using sword mode more when playing for SAED than Savage Axe, it's also going to be generally a better idea than normal to look for the opportunity to keep your sword charged with energy for that additional damage while building up SAEDs. This is much less of a concern when playing for Savage Axe, though. When we're playing for Savage Axe mode, though, after charging your shield, you absolutely do want to overcharge your files, as that overcharge damage is going to be utilized for the next several minutes and not just the next attack. Next, we need to get into Savage Axe mode. If at any point during the building phase you manage to get a perfect guard off and enter it through a counterattack, that's great. But if that hasn't happened by the time you have overcharged files and a shield infusion ready, you're either going to fish for that perfect guard, look to perform a mount on the monster assuming it's off cooldown, or attempt to cause a wound so that you can rend to enter Savage Axe. The act of actually getting into Savage Axe can vary in the amount of time it takes. If you're sitting on overcharged files for an awkwardly long period of time, attempting to cause a wound to rend with elemental discharges or SAEDs can be a good way to fill that gap in time. Wounds also get harder to cause the longer the fight goes on, however, so you'll want to practice those perfect guard timings as a reliable method with no diminishing returns based on the duration of the fight when it comes to getting into Savage Axe reliably. Once we manage all of that, though, you'll want to spend as much time as possible shredding with held elemental discharge 1 and 2 attacks. After your second discharge, you can either continue the combo with a standard attack in Axe mode, which can also be held down with Savage Axe, then loop back to discharges. Or, if you have the opening, begin spending your files half of one at a time by activating aids after your discharge 2 with a further held heavy attack as well as the preceding follow-up potentially, as these will deal extremely high damage in exchange for that half a file. Axe mode in general I find much more user-friendly when playing almost entirely in focus mode, as the attacks are quite slow and are typically better when aimed manually. This is especially the case when utilizing SAEDs. That's more or less a complete rundown on the playstyles for Charge Blade, so now let's hone in on the more universal and important combos that you're going to want to be utilizing. First, you're going to need to know how to stay mobile with Charge Blade. Charge Blade, in the grand scheme of things, is not the most mobile, but far from the least mobile weapon.
Spawn. It's okay. Sponge.
While in sword mode, performing a heavy attack while pressing in any direction, either as a combo opener or as a follow-up for weak slash, will perform a fade slash, which is the sliding animation followed by a horizontal swipe. Regardless of whether you're in sword or axe mode, you can also perform the initial sword slashes of a double rend by pressing sprint while in focus mode. This is also a great way to shift back to sword mode while keeping yourself mobile. These two moves can even be used back to back, and should be used regularly to maneuver around the monster in addition to rolling out of the way of attacks, as these two moves drastically improve the flow of combat when using the Charge Blade. While in Axe mode, it's also going to be important to keep in mind that pressing forward in addition to initiating either a standard or heavy attack will move you in that direction before the swing when used as a combo opener or when used to follow up the opposite type of attack. Get used to utilizing these small adjustments in your position to stay on target, or even evading incoming attacks while maintaining your flow. If you find yourself in a bad situation where you've just been knocked down, you're missing a bunch of health, and maybe even need to sharpen, call your bird to pick you up. This lets you soft reset the fight, then go back in for a potential mount, or re-enter the fight via jumping attacks in either sword or axe mode depending on where you were in your rotation to get back on track. When it comes to getting the Charge Blade actually charged with Phials, there isn't really a wrong way to do it. Primarily, Monster Hunter is about knowing what you can get away with in various situations. Weak slashes might not be getting us anywhere fast as far as charge rate, but sometimes that's all you're going to have time for. The fastest way to charge up, however, is by holding heavy attacks to activate charge slashes, as these produce much more energy than the rest of the sword's moveset. We can follow this up by a simultaneous action pressing both standard and heavy attack for a shield bash, then immediately charge another slash into a Phial Charge. This can even loop back to yet another charge slash rotation, getting you up to 5 overcharged Phials the quickest way possible. Keep in mind though, this combo might be the quickest way to max out your Phials, but you are immobile and vulnerable to attack while doing it. So don't overuse this and don't overcommit more than you can get away with. This combo is important, but shouldn't be the only way you charge up your Phials. Mixing in mobility moves, weak slashes, and guard points are just as important to using this weapon. So what are guard points though? Guard points are effectively frames that are the same as a perfect guard. The Charge Blade has several different attacks that have a point within the attack animation itself, typically near the end, where your shield flashes white. As an example, manually charging your shield after a Phial Charge has a guard point at the end following the shield becoming infused. When you see this white flash, if a monster attacks you during those frames, you'll perfect guard the attack, opening up your counter options, preventing most of the damage and preventing stagger. Guard points are, in my opinion, the most difficult mechanic to utilize well with the Charge Blade, as it's not only requiring good timing, but also to some extent good knowledge of the boss's attack patterns so you can sync up those frames with incoming attacks. Before you build up that muscle memory and knowledge, however, these will likely just end up being utilized as happy accidents when you happen to line up these frames with incoming damage. A good example of how to regularly utilize these frames is, instead of doing the optimal sword charging rotation that we just spoke about, you can, instead of following up Charge Slash with a Shield Bash, follow it up with just a standard attack input for a Round Slash. This ends with a pretty generously lengthy guard point, creating an overall safer charging rotation than the slightly faster Shield Bashing combo. Another pretty useful guard point to be aware of is right at the beginning of Morph Slash when entering Axe mode, and right at the end when using it to switch back to Sword mode. Using these with their timings in mind can help you keep up the aggression when you have otherwise been forced to go on the defensive and maneuver. Morphing back into Sword mode is particularly useful, as this is the fastest guard point that you can access while you're in Axe mode, where you might have otherwise been caught out by an attack with a particularly hard to dodge surface area. Likely the most difficult guard point to use though on purpose occurs when we infuse our shield the fast way by canceling out of the sword to aid combo. The elemental round slash that follows that combo has an ending guard point. But due to how deep in your combo that is, thinking that far ahead to purposely guard an incoming attack in most situations won't be possible, and will be typically filed under the happy accident category when it happens. It is worth noting though that you can cancel out of any aid with this combo, meaning you can access a guard point pretty quickly if you happen to have overcommitted your attacks. And that is just about everything that you could possibly want to know about the Charge Blade's mechanics. This is my first time making Monster Hunter content, and I gotta say, I'm quite enjoying doing it so far. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know by liking the video and subbing to the channel so that I know that there is an interest in me making more Monster Hunter content in the future, such as a Charge Blade build guide. If there's a topic you'd like to see me cover in this style and level of detail beyond that though, please be sure to let me know what it is in the comments down below. If you'd like to see me live, I also live stream on both YouTube and Twitch 3 days a week, so feel free to come by and ask any questions that you might have there. Or join my Discord, where we've just expanded to having a Monster Hunter section for our community, as well as in-game squad. Thank you to my coffee supporters who help keep the channel going, and happy hunting!